Thank you so much for having me, OTel in Practice. I have been attending the last few sessions and excited to present a little bit about my world. So I am Paige Cruz. I work at Chronosphere. It is my third observability company. When I wasn't working for observability companies, I was an SRE at customers of those observability companies working on observability. So if you can't tell, I have thought about this stuff for a very long time and from lots of different perspectives. And just a kind of a quick tale from the field, I have retired from SRE. Today, I'm a dev advocate that really focuses on the open source side of observability. But in my day, when I was practicing, I had to lead. My team was always tasked with leading big observability initiatives, whether that's migrating from one vendor to another, off of self-hosted open source onto maybe a managed service from one of our cloud providers, rolling out tracing. Oh my God, the logging bill's so high, you got to get on it. There's just a lot of things that kind of fall under the observability umbrella that were kind of targeted for my team to be the stewards of. And what I found when we had to do these initiatives that touched every team, like re-instrumenting either to add traces or away from a proprietary protocol onto beautiful open source OTel, that yes, technically, if the dev teams were too busy, my team could do heads down work for like 3 or 4 quarters. And yeah, we could deliver something and we could be migrated by the end of that session. However, then we were really seen as like the owners of observability, and we were kind of treated as like Ask Jeeves. And it just really felt like the line of responsibility between ops and dev kind of went out of whack. And that's totally fair. We moved everything. It was new platform, new UI, new libraries. Of course, there was going to be a lot of knowledge gaps to cover. And so I have steered quite a few migrations, and I can say I've got to try lots of different tactics to be able to delegate that re-instrumentation work or to really pass that baton of ownership rightfully from solely on ops over to app devs as well. And the best tactics out of everything I tried, linking the docs, sending conference talks, the best was hands-on workshops that were specifically tailored to my org's tech stack, what we were trying to get developers to do, the value that it brings at the end of the day. So this is why I wanted to bring Train the Trainer, how to train. Specifically, we're talking about tracing training today, and that just requires participation from devs across the stack, up and down. And to quote the seminal work High School Musical, we are all in this together. So let's talk about why train. Does it matter? Yes. Let's talk about how are you actually going to develop a training, these aha moments. Unless you were a teacher in a previous career, you probably don't have a strong background in learning theory or delivering trainings and teaching. So let's just get into what you need to know to train folks. And then I'll kind of walk through some really specific decisions that I made when developing the KubeCon workshop. And then probably the favorite part of anything that I put together is the further resources. So please, I will share these slides, books, talks, things that can help you along your journey. So why does training matter? Well, there are a few layers of complexity that we're talking about when it comes to, say, introducing tracing. And the first thing is like, full stop, observability is still emerging. It is something that today we have learned basically on the job, pretty informally. It kind of depends on what tech stack your company has, what vendors or protocols that your company is using, how many companies you've worked for, what you've seen. So even two developers with the same amount of years of experience could have totally different sets of knowledge about this space. And so yeah, like a baby is not sitting there thinking about like the milestones that we have been reaching. Like that is just not happening. We have to teach this stuff. And while it is done, and while I think the informal approach is important for developing like operational skills and sort of how do you use this data in the heat of an incident to decide on mitigations, you still have to find some sort of way to bridge that gap between the formal patchwork knowledge and a strong foundation that you can build on so that your developers can, say, add tracing or maybe bring down the bill or understand how sampling affects like viewing aggregate trace data. There's like a lot of complicated stuff in this space. And so you really got to think about where your learners are, what they know, what they might have seen. And specifically, so we've got observability, kind of new emerging domain. We're kind of bringing some things from monitoring, but we're also discovering a lot of new stuff. Within observability, we've got OpenTelemetry, which totally used to just be known for tracing. I'm like so happy that OTel has now like subsumed, like I think the collector is the more popular, like most well-known component at this point, which is kind of cool. But unless you have been really interested in observability or specifically tasked with bringing OTel into your org, like a lot of my like developer friends that I talk to they're like, oh, that's cool. OTel exists. We're on, some vendor. It's not really something I'm looking into. So while we are like, oh my God, exponential histograms, logs are GA, like all this stuff is happening, it's real, there's still a whole like segment of our colleagues that maybe haven't even heard of OTel. And if you were to just say, hey, add tracing to this service, here's a link to the OTel docs. It's got everything you need to know. If they don't know what a span is, if they don't know how to navigate or the different components of OTel, like maybe y'all are using a vendor's collector versus the OTel, like there are just a lot of ways that you could get lost within the OTel project. And so observability, new, OpenTelemetry, new and rapidly evolving. And finally, the nugget is for tracing, in particular, the problem that I have seen is that it is like really has this reputation as a tool for like power users, the superset of engineers. And to be fair, like if I reflect on like how I got to my tracing knowledge, I literally like worked building the tracing product at New Relic and then went to Lightstep to go be an SRE and support the like tracing infrastructure there. And so I've like had to think about tracing a lot. I've had to work on these systems, and that is just like not a repeatable experience for everybody, nor should it be. We need all types of people to develop all sorts of things. And so this was the problem that I really honed in on for my workshop was like, I think tracing is really a super valuable type of telemetry. I want more people to use tracing. One of the barriers that I see is that, yes, partial traces still can be helpful, but the best case is that you've got a full, complete trace end to end throughout your system, which requires every service owner along the way to do their part in instrumenting and then using that data. So I said, this is the problem that I want to solve, and I want to help people both know how to send trace data, oh my God, and how to use trace data. Because just having the information alone of how to instrument isn't enough if you don't know what to do when you get to a trace waterfall. So the like counterpoints that I've heard, the doc site has everything they need to know. I wrote the exact instructions down. They just have to follow them. But while I will say the OTel documentation site is absolutely fabulous, I rely on it all the time. I still see things, a lot of questions like, is this library instrumented with OTel? Is the Ruby like log spec, like where is that at? And those are like very easily answered questions if you know where to look at the doc site. Just linking to OpenTelemetry.io is not going to necessarily help someone navigate through our set of projects. Yeah, so yes, plug for the OTel doc site. It is fabulous, but people need more than just the knowledge, they need the skills. So very quickly, who here, you can maybe raise your hand or throw it in the chat, who here has taken a training course at work? You don't have to tell me where or what, but you've taken a training course that just felt like a total waste of time. You really could have used those extra 2 hours and actually done something productive. I will raise my hand. I have sat through a couple of those. It's okay. I know it's been out there. Even our mandatory trainings that we've got to take. Sometimes you're like eye roll. So bad training is very different than good training. It could be that the training course you took, you were already an expert and it was just covering stuff you already knew. It could be it wasn't tailored to your use case, like your company signed up for generic Kafka training, but actually you needed to know how to tune and specifically like level up the operations for your cluster with your configurations and everything within the context of your org. So the like generic 101 Kafka training wasn't going to do anything for you. It wasn't tailored to your use case. And then also it could just be the format and the delivery was totally mismatched. Like for me, I'm not a morning person, so anything that's before 9 a.m., good luck. My brain is not firing at full capacity. And so there's a lot of, if you've encountered bad training, this is not what I'm advising you to do. We're going to talk about how you avoid some of those things and have effective training. So to answer kind of this section, why does it matter? Why does training matter? Well, I came across this quote that made me so sad, but like is totally exemplifies this. I don't even know what I don't know, which makes it pretty hard to get started answering my own questions. And this was some anonymous user on Reddit who's trying to find out things about OpenTelemetry. And that is the case. Like, this is where we need to start. This is where our learners are. There are some people for whom OTel is this like mystical black box that they don't know anything about. And if you're on this call, I'm pretty sure you know your way around the projects, you know the architecture, you know what's up, but we've got to keep in mind that we're kind of a select group here and that observability and OTel knowledge needs to be very widely distributed, democratized, and that is why training is important because not everybody is here where we are yet, and we need them here for full traces, for better observability across companies, across industries. Yeah. So that's the why. Let's just talk about the how now. We don't want to replicate the bad, awful trainings that we have been through. But what I kind of shortened this as, you want to find these aha moments of discovery. You want to have these learners engaged. And really, the whole point of training is that you are trying to change behavior or get learners to take actions. So just giving them a rote so for my workshop, if I had just given them, here's the step-by-steps of how to instrument specifically a Python Flask application with traces. Cool. They could leave and they would know for that tech stack, like where to go, where to find that information, and how to get traces out of that. Maybe they work at a place that has Ruby or works on Ruby on Rails. If I didn't do the work to explain the higher level concepts, or here's the OTel registry, you can use it to check any language instrumentation library. If you don't include the like actionable pieces in the takeaways, people can still get really lost, even if your instructions were so beautiful and so detailed. Believe me, I have tried that route. So where you want to start with training is finding the gap, which is between where your developers are today, what they know, what they understand, what they've seen, and where you want them to be. What actions do they need to take? Do they need to re-instrument from proprietary format to OTel metrics format? Do they need to add spans? Do they need to take away spans? Because maybe the auto instrumentation they turned on is like totally blowing up the bill. Like really think concretely about what should happen after this training. What are you expecting to see the results and the change? And then that gap between where they are, where you want them to be, that is where your training needs to fill. And we're not going to get deep into learning theory, but really two things. What do they need to know? Knowledge, what info? And then skills. What do they need to be able to do with that knowledge? Together, that is the recipe for a successful training. And so when you're identifying the gap, get clear on the problem you're trying to solve. What is the main driver of the initiative? Better visibility. Is there a problem area in like the profitable part of your system and you really need deeper level visibility there? Do you want to own your data? If you think about the motivations, that can help you really scope down, because for us observability experts, it is very tempting to include the whole world, be like, well, let's start with open tracing and open census and before open telemetry, and like you will lose people. I promise you. I promise you will lose people if you do that. So getting really crystal clear on answering these questions for yourself will set you up to really hone down the exact things you need to train on. And if you don't know your learners or you don't know what they already know or what they're exposed to, send a survey, do some informal coffee chats, and make sure that you're including a variety of roles. Grab front-end engineers, grab security engineers, back-end, edge, network, because it does take everybody. You need a representative sample to really be able to understand your learner base. And sometimes it helps to think about the flip side. So like, where do I want them to be? If you're having trouble answering that, think about what is the consequence if they get this wrong? What is the consequence if we don't reduce the bill or add tracing in this next quarter in order to evaluate, companies or whatever? Sometimes you can just flip the script because you can get a little bit lost in this wide world. So as a small exercise to think about who our learners are, and so I can make the point that learning and knowledge gaps are totally understandable and expected, no matter your seniority when it comes to observability and monitoring, let's maybe consider a few learners. We've got like a new grad. They are probably like maybe first job, probably were exposed to logging at some point in their education, and maybe if they did an internship or something, but excited to learn, doesn't know where to start, needs both the knowledge and the skills. Kind of best case to have somebody like excited to learn because you will encounter resistant adult learners sometimes. Even thinking about a senior developer, thinking about the background, did they work at a mega corporation where there were so many teams that handled developer productivity and platform engineering that they are used to the amazing capabilities and benefits of observability, but going to a smaller org, I've got to add instrumentation. We don't have a wrapper library that is always up to date and covers what I need to know. Even with senior engineering, it's tempting to say, oh, they should know what to do. Send them the docs, send them the ticket, let them do the work. But it really depends on where you've worked and what you've been exposed to. If you've worked at a small startup, you know that you've touched almost every part of an observability stack, from the bill to setting up collectors to doing instrumentation within applications. So really think through, what people's backgrounds are. That's why this is so individualized and contextualized. It's why a generic 101, basic training won't meet everybody's needs, because everybody's kind of coming and bringing to the table a different set of knowledge. And by the time you're a staff engineer, I guess I would assume, maybe you shouldn't assume, you've seen a lot of systems. You've seen what works. You've seen what doesn't work. You've seen the rise of observability within monitoring, and you probably got a lot of opinions on how things should go. That is awesome. And developing a training to meet both the staff engineer's needs and the new grad's needs is probably a stretch. So that is why we want to think about our learners. However, I will say one of the tips is to have, once you've got a training kind of sketched out, you've got your first draft, having both a novice walk through it and an expert walk through it, and kind of watching what they do, kind of seeing where the stumbling blocks are. That is a very powerful exercise. So tap into that expertise when it exists in your org. Cool. Okay, so when it comes to actually let's create our material, what is this course going to be on? Again, the reason I keep saying you've got to scope it to what do they actually need to do with this information? It's because while I was making the 101 instrumentation workshop, oh my God, all I had to cut so much out. I did not know how much I wanted to include in there. And so I had to get really crystal clear on, at the end of this workshop, I want attendees to leave and be able to bring OpenTelemetry tracing instrumentation into their own projects. I wanted them to be independent. I wanted them to be able to take this knowledge and use it in their daily life. So that meant that was my guiding star. Anytime I was like, should I put this in? This feels like it's too long. I went back to say, would this help them independently instrument traces in the future? Yes or no? If no, cut it out. So grounding experiences in the real world context, that is where you will have a huge leg up if you're developing it for just your organization or business, because you're sharing common organizational goals of selling the product or the service or whatever it is that you do. So you already have kind of a shared context and community. You're all working within the same tech stack. So while I had to make a choice of what is going to be the most easy to read language, minimal framework that I could kind of take any developer and walk them through instrumentation, you would get to say, oh, we do Go and Java, and these are our frameworks. And you can really create the dev environment and the exercises to mimic what your developers would be doing in the real world. That being said, if you're developing it for an org, I would say your best bet is to host an instrumentathon where you have folks actually bring their real service that you're asking them to instrument and working through it with them. Sandboxes and tutorials are great when you have sort of a wider, more generic use case, but always get as specific as you possibly can be and scope things down. So you have a leg up if you're working on one for your org. And then again, like, what is the absolute minimum setup and dev environment? I think I talk about it later, but I really was torn on whether or not I should introduce the collector. Because you think about the collector is this big component of OTel, surely people are going to be running into this in the future. Wouldn't it benefit them to know kind of really that full path that telemetry takes? However, when I saw that the Jaeger all-in-one image had a native OTLP endpoint, I was like, oh my God, collector, bye-bye. We only have two things to run. That is only two things to have to debug if something goes wrong during the workshop. That is much better than three, and it cut out a whole, part of like configuring the collector, running the collector, and my workshop wasn't about production-ready tracing system infrastructure. It was, how can you get traces today, and do you know what to do with them? So again, like major benefits if you're working with a group of people with a shared mission, working on the same like system and tech stack. And then when it comes to delivering, really tap into what already exists in your network. Like, yes, a standalone training can do the job, but if your organization has communities of practice, or like sometimes they're called chapters, like chapter backend or chapter front end, times and places to exchange ideas and learn on the job, tap into that and ask the organizers if you can host the next meeting and do the workshop or get their help in advertising. Because with these organization-wide initiatives, just sending one Slack about a training is not going to get many people showing up. Maybe you've got people who can make it mandatory, that's cool, but forcing learning is also kind of comes with its own battles. So the second thing you want to consider is the modalities. Lots of people learn different ways. A lot of us work in distributed remote organizations, so you can't even count on being in the same time zone as somebody. So make sure that you provide both like a live guided session for people to, that mimics more of a classroom, self-guided, but make sure that you've got office hours for people to check in with you. And then, you can always record a live session and make that available as well. But having these multiple ways means you're going to have more luck getting more people actually getting through this content, learning the things they need to learn, and doing whatever you need them to do to increase system observability. So I guess like to recap, you want to like really think about what is the problem you're trying to solve with this training. You've got to figure out where your learners are today, then you've got where you want them to go, and then just really narrow that training gap and scope it as small as possible for the best success. So we'll take a quick look at some of the choices that I made for this workshop. And the first is, do not reinvent the wheel. Like, I did not start with a blank page and I said, okay, instrumentation, let's go. Like, no. The beauty of working with open source and working with OTel is that my friends, like Reese has fabulous, like I look at Reese's metrics workshops all the time and the talks that she's done, and Adriana, like everybody across the vendors and our open source community members have already contributed a ton of interesting tutorials and knowledge. And it's really about shaping and scoping that down for your use case. And yeah, making sure that it fits. And so you're not starting from scratch. You weren't hired to be a teacher or instructional designer. Please borrow, particularly the way that folks organize information. You could take my Python Flask workshop and totally rewrite it in whatever language and framework you want while keeping the same structure and sort of curriculum and lesson flow, because that's where I spent a lot of my time. So it doesn't need to be a copy pasta thing, but it's really like, use what exists. This is the beauty of having an open and sharing environment. The other thing is vendors often provide training on their specific platform and products. What I will say is sometimes if you take those trainings, you're introduced to all of the features and all of the products on the platform that your org maybe doesn't even pay for or use or has interest in. And so that can contribute to learners being like, this didn't address my needs. This is a waste of time. Hey, why don't we have synthetics turned on or whatever? And so I think borrowing the curriculum, borrowing the phrases, the links, the resources, how concepts are mapped out one by one, great. And if you're all in on one platform, go ahead and use the vendor training. But that is just my word of advice there. So what was the problem I was trying to solve? I believe tracing is an underutilized telemetry type. And I think a major barrier to implementation is purely getting useful data out, getting to that complete trace as a starting point. And so, in my opinion, the best way to tackle that was to teach application developers, because a lot of us in ops and a lot of us in SRE have been talking about tracing forever. It's the app devs we've got to reach. They're the ones we need to do the instrumentation. So that was my guiding light, getting app devs to instrument traces and actually use trace data. My learners were app devs interested in open source who are running cloud native systems. I think tracing is useful always. Well, I shouldn't say always. I think tracing is very, very helpful no matter the size of your system. However, specifically working at KubeCon and CNCF, I was targeting cloud native systems. And what did they already know? I did not have the benefit of having access to my attendees ahead of time. And so the assumptions I made were that they were likely familiar with metrics and logs, that they might have had exposure to APM, application performance monitoring, and that they were curious about tracing and OpenTelemetry. Because no one signs up for an OpenTelemetry workshop if they don't know what it already is, even at like the highest level. So that's what I started. How did I scope down? What was our minimum like local dev environment? I chose Flask and Python. Python for its very welcoming community on just like as a language as the whole. Flask because it is a framework that doesn't do magic stuff behind the scenes. You don't really need to know the ins and outs of Flask in order to just like look at it. It's a very basic like web app. And if learners wanted to continue on and maybe like extend the workshop, the Python, specifically the Python OpenTelemetry cookbook section in the documentations for the Python instrumentation libraries for tracing are excellent. So I knew if people wanted to go further, that those resources would be available to them. Obviously, OTel APIs and SDKs for instrumenting. And then, yeah, where did I want to store and visualize these traces? Well, this was a workshop focused on local development of traces. So the Jaeger all-in-one, where you're holding those traces in memory, was a fine, totally acceptable use case for this. We were only going to be generating a few requests at once and kind of, it was mostly building up the feedback loop of adding instrumentation code, running the services, verifying that the data matched what we wanted, and like over and over again. So we didn't need to hold stuff long-term. So Jaeger fit. And because this was an open source for open source conferences, it needed to be all open source up and down the stack. So Jaeger fit, although I'm really excited to see some other, I think is it OTel Desktop Viewer, I hope is getting revived. I see murmurs of that. I would like to have lots of options, but this is what I went with. And then I kicked off, it feels silly, but I always kick off with a definition of observability because I think if you asked like 5 developers to define it, you would get 10 different answers. Actually, I think you'd get more than 5 different answers back. And so when you're conducting this training, it's important that you start with like, these are the terms we use. This is what it means for this org or for this project, or this is what they mean here. You may have a different idea. Let's talk about that. But like for this session, here's where we're grounding. It doesn't need to be long, literally 1-sentence definitions. We don't want to overwhelm or bore people, especially at the beginning of a training. And then from there, I had talked about my big debate. Do I include the collector? Do I not? Here's what I decided to do. I thought it will serve people to know about it. I'm going to include the big OTel diagram from the docs. Again, doc site showing up here. Love it. It's not a knock on the doc site. We just got to help people learn where to go to find the info. So I talked about the collector briefly. I kind of said, here's where it sits in the overall OTel like kind of architecture and the project landscape. Here's when you would use it. Today, we're using a more simplified version, or you don't, but the purpose of putting the slide is they know what it is, they can connect it to some other ideas within OTel, and the next time they hear it in the wild in a conversation, they go, oh, okay, it was like we can send telemetry data through that. That is a fine place for beginners to be, especially app devs who are likely not going to be like tuning collector configs. And so the hardest thing I think to do is to introduce new concepts and skills one at a time. Because if you've been working with this stuff for a while, you have like the cursive knowledge where you just don't even know what it's like to be a beginner. You don't even know what would be a fire hose of information versus like this beautiful, nice breadcrumbs. So like if you think back to your first day on the job, you probably had HR benefits, then IT laptop setup, and then maybe like a session with the CEO about the history of the company. And then you're like whisked off to lunch. And then by the end of the afternoon, you finally get to your laptop, you get to your desk, and you've got like 100 emails and you're like missed meetings you didn't know about. And like all of that is just so overwhelming when you're getting started. So really, really focusing on just one little concept at a time is like also should be a guiding principle. So the way I broke instrumentation up, I looked at a lot of different tutorials, and I will admit, I got a little bit confused because I would be looking at the same tech stack that they were trying to instrument, and the code samples would kind of vary. And I looked at a bunch and I said, what is this like missing concept here? What is this missing link? And what it turned out to be was people were upfront deciding whether they wanted to do automatic, programmatic, or manual instrumentation without explicitly saying, hey, this is what I'm doing and why. And so that meant if you were to just take one of those tutorials that maybe did all automatic, you might be really confused when someone asks you to manually add a span attribute because you were like, the OTel agent is like wrapping my service call, like it's doing everything. What do you mean? And so that for me was the gap that I wanted to fill, is to know when and where to use automatic, programmatic, and manual. And there's no like bearing the lead, like show everything up front. This is in module 1. I'm like, here's automatic, programmatic, manual. Here's the differences, no surprises. And one note on the automatic, it is really nice to get a quick win in very early for learners. I decided to use for automatic instrumentation just the console span exporter, because for a lot of these folks, it was their first time even like thinking of a span, knowing what a span is. And the textual representation I thought was kind of nice to look at and become familiar with. What I could have done was like put up an example span and like blah, 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 lectured through all the trace ID and parent ID. Or we could set up auto instrumentation. They could get their first span in front of them. And then I could say, hey, do you notice this thing? And then they're looking at their laptop, they're engaged, it's their data. This is sort of that aha moment I'm talking about. We don't want to lecture at people, but we want them to discover on their own, because that just goes so much further. We do learn by doing. Programmatic, manual. Yeah. So the other thing I did was break up how and why. So after we do automatic, we move on to programmatic. And once we have traces that have multiple spans, like the textual representation, like heck no, we got to start looking at this in a waterfall. So I took the time to do a quick tour of Jaeger of each of the different visualizations and kind of talk through, here's how you analyze them, here's what you're looking for, here's how to search and filter. And I ended that how section with this slide on why, because traces, I think, are very different from metrics and logs. And so I was like, why do we have so many visualizations? Why did I just show you like 10 slides of different ways that you can interact with and manipulate this data? And it's like, well, the power of tracing, the zoom out, the zoom in, the telescope, the microscope, but separating, but following up the how to with the why was a really key component for people's like light bulbs to go off. So with that, I wanted to share a few more resources and then kind of dive into hearing what training needs y'all have. These 2 books, highly recommend, designed for how people learn. It is hilarious. It is funny. It is a book on learning that like it is not boring at all. She walks the walk in this book, as well as Better Onboarding from A Book Apart, which is also a fantastic publisher. When with all of the talk about internal development platforms and platform engineering and treating your platform like a product, like let's just borrow the good books they're using already, like Better Onboarding, and think about how to bring that into onboarding to observability. Open observability resources. I love that the OTel docs have a specific section that's like, are you a developer? Like, and you want to learn more, start here versus are you ops, start here. Like that really speaks to knowing who the audience is. The CNCF glossary, it's helpful to have bookmarked. Sometimes people ask you about acronyms and maybe you don't remember or you want sort of an official resource to turn to. That one is nice, plain text, like small, like it is just very plainly defined. And then finally, while my workshop was not real world, right? It was a very small Flask app. It had 3 endpoints. If you wanted something more realistic to look at, the OpenTelemetry demo is your choice. It's got, I believe all the languages. It exercises almost every part of OTel that is like GA now. Super helpful resource. That would be the one that I would use if I knew what hardware my learners had, because it was a little bit of a mouth breather last time I ran it. Okay, and then learning experiences. So there is the tracing workshop that I gave at KubeCon is self-guided. It's up, it's on GitLab, but it's set up as like a slideshow, so you just kind of work through it at your own pace. There's a recorded session, which is sort of where I'm teaching the workshop and I'm able to use more words than I put on the slides. And then sort of related, I developed a different learning experience for on-call onboarding when I was at Lightstep, and I presented on how and why to do your own on-call onboarding at SRECon last year. That is a great talk, and it is a practice that has evolved to multiple companies past Lightstep. So it has kind of proven itself out in the world. So I believe we are, oh yes, got to do my attributions. Thank you to SlidesGo for the slide templates, flat icon, and FreePick and StorySet for all of the beautiful things. I am not an artist. I am not a teacher. I am just a developer advocate who wants people to trace more things. So with that, I'm really curious to learn, does this resonate with folks? Do you have training needs today? Do you want to talk through some tactics or ways to learn about your learners? Let's talk.
I actually have a couple questions, Paige. The first is, are you able to share, do you have a shareable copy of your slide deck?
Yes, our Google Workspace is really locked down, so I will need 5 minutes after this meeting to get that over to you. But
Oh, no
yes.
worries. And then I was also curious, how do you measure results, or like what are some strategies to measure results from your workshops?
Yeah. So my workshop in particular, I looked at the attendee feedback and I talked to folks afterwards, and especially the folks that had raised hands and had questions or hit a stumbling block. I wanted to make sure because somebody had an issue pip installing something in a virtual environment and it was like not something I'd seen before and it was not something I could troubleshoot on the spot. So I walked them through, okay, this is what I was trying to teach you here. Here's another way that you can get at this. What do you need to go forward? So there's a little bit of that personal one-on-one, and then they send out a survey. And so I always look at survey results, mostly not the numbers. Not a social scientist. I know people like the Likert scale, but I really care more about what people took the time to type and say. And so folks had said, like, this was a great introduction. This is my favorite tutorial. Like, thank you so much. And so I'm like, okay, we did good. If I was developing this for my company, so say you have an initiative that you need to re-instrument away from proprietary onto OTel metrics by the end of next quarter. Okay. So where you want your learners to be is well, what you want at the end of the day is maybe all of your services instrumented with OTel metrics. Cool. What's standing in the way? Where are your learners today? Well, half of them are using vendor A, the other half are on vendor B, and then maybe the ops team is like secretly running Prometheus somewhere, and you're like, oh my God. So in that case, I would say like, okay, well, for the Prometheus folks, there's like a bit of education to do with the interoperability between Prom and OTel metrics and kind of talking through which approach do we want? Do we want to use the pull-based or do we want to do the push-based? That is kind of the training and the knowledge and the skills that we need there for each of the vendors, like I do think it is helpful to have this is how you would do it in vendor A, and this is how it needs to be. This is how you need to change your behavior. Sort of a use this library, not that library, the contrasting from where they are in the context of what they know to here's the OTel metrics like cookbook for, oh my God, the cookbook for Python. Here's the, it'll go away. Here's and even a really basic like primer on metrics again, because I even with like, yes, observability is great. When we talk about monitoring, really we talk a lot about metrics and thresholds and alerts. And that is still an area that I see is like underserved as we like threw the pager at the developers and ran away. We like kind of forgot to teach them all the stuff we learned after years of like fighting with incidents and trying to understand our systems better and measure them. So I think in that case, yeah, I would just really get as specific as you can on what these groups would have in common and then map from there to the goal. So I would measure the success of like, okay, 2 weeks after the workshop or 1 week after the workshop, how many PRs did I see get through? How many services either started their reinstrumentation, finished their reinstrumentation? I would kind of use that to track the progress of the project, which is sort of the lagging indicator of like, did they learn the thing or not? Yeah, but those are great questions. Do
Thank
you
you.
have a favorite training that you've held or you've led? Do you want to share how like I love your metric stuff, so you want to talk a little bit about how you made choices there?
Um, I mean, so it's interesting because I did the metrics, I did a metrics talk twice,
Hmm.
and so I changed it up the second time just based on like, questions that people had and stuff that I had wanted to kind of put in, but didn't have time or hadn't quite figured out how to put into it. But, I think what you're talking about is not applicable just for workshops, but like
Hmm.
really anything that involves like a wider audience. Cause, I think I frequently am like, oh, what kind of level do I need to assume that people are at so
Yeah, it's
that I
really hard.
know. Yeah, and you can make like general assumptions about, okay, well, this event, whatever, but sometimes it's yeah, I don't know, sometimes you just guess and hope it fits the most people, Sometimes, yeah, there'll be like one or two people that were like, oh, this was like way too beginner, or like two people that would say the opposite, like this is, way over my head. And yeah, so I
Yeah,
was trying
that's, I
to
think
say,
scoping like, does it need to be novice? Does it need to be mid-level where I assume some things? Or am I talking to the expert that probably wrote a system like this in the past? That it is, you can't stretch one training to fit all those groups for sure.
yeah, I know. And yeah, I'm always like, I feel like on the verge of, oh, I want to, because I always appreciate, people who explain things very well. And so trying to, fit that for the people that are there, but also like not wanting to piss the more advanced people off. Not necessarily like piss them off, but like, kind of have to be like, oh no, this is more basic than I wanted. So I
Yeah.
was like,
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's hard. And when I write blog posts and stuff, the people who edit are always like, you don't need to include the whole history of observability. You could kind of just like start with your topic. I'm like, but people still don't know. I work a lot of booth duty and I go, oh, are you happy with, observability at your company today? And they go, what's that? And I'm like, okay. All right, let's start at not the beginning, but let's start at do you have monitoring? Oh, okay. And yeah, just finding those ways to meet people where they are, because we do use a lot of insider academic terms, telemetry. Um,
mhm.
there's just no shortage of them in this space. So yes, I do think the quality of the questions that you get asked, maybe in your Slack help channels, can really tell you if your training was a hit or a miss. Because if you're continuing to get, hey, is this random JavaScript library instrumented with OTel? It's like, I don't want to be rude and like point you to the registry, but also like, did you take the training? Making sure you track who takes the training is also huge, because I have been on tiny teams that have kind of manpowered through migrations, and we would get developers kind of treating us like we were the owners of their own CI pipelines. And we would say, oh, so and so, we noticed you haven't taken the training yet. I totally get why, this is a confusing thing. Why don't you check out lesson 2? Here's the link. And then it's like, okay, we're negotiating the boundaries of responsibility between operators and developers. I think we're still, even though like DevOps movement we're like many years past that, it does still feel like we are negotiating these boundaries when it comes to monitoring and observability. No one team should be in charge of this. You should be as experts, you should be the advisors, the consultants, the guides, but not the like total tyrannical like owners of the thing. It's exhausting to be responsible at that level. So yeah, or does anybody have good trainings that they've taken that they want to share, or ideas for courses? Yeah, like Reese said, sometimes we can get in our head about like, what do people even want to know? Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, thanks, and thanks for the talk. That resonated very well with me. Sort of just on your last point specifically, I was going to ask. One of the things I think we struggle with is like this ownership boundary of we provide some training, or maybe not even training. I don't know if we do that well, but teams are like, we need observability in our app, or not even our app. Like, I'm a team that owns a framework that dozens of teams at my org uses, and we help them implement sort of, tracing, let's say, at the root of that. So the app developer doesn't even need to know. But then like, a month passes, 3 months passes, and something's not working properly. They want to add something, and they're always like looking to us to be the ones to like do the work, or again, advising them is my role. So it's
Yeah.
like, that's okay. But like, I just feel like they don't really end up ever taking ownership. Like it's a common pattern.
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm asking for, or opening a discussion on, is just like, how would you drive the connection between like the training and the knowledge transfers, et cetera, and then like defining where that boundary lies? Because I always feel like people treat observability as like a third-class citizen, when I feel like it needs to be their first-class citizen. Like, we get all these incidents, the directors talk about it, et cetera, but they don't take the ownership at the end of the day. So I'm just curious about your experience in that relationship.
I'm hoping somebody on the call has experience working at a like mid-size or larger companies, because unfortunately I have been at startups where I have not had like a director of SRE, or really even like I do think it comes down to engineering leadership needing to explicitly like say, here's what platform or ops or SRE provides, and here's what you're responsible for. Sort of like the cloud security, this shared responsibility model between the cloud provider and you. Like, and yes, there's like the fuzzy boundary in the middle, which is where you would do some consulting. But I have not been able to successfully win the owners, like get ownership successfully established, because of the kind of the nature of the companies I worked at. But I'm really curious, like Adriana, I know you've worked at some big shops. You've seen a lot in the field.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can say that like from personal experience, like I worked at an organization that was like they hired me in to do observability, like to lead an observability practices team. And yet when it came time to like, okay, let's get the developers to instrument their code, they're like, huh, why can't you do it? So it really, and then similarly, like, or I should say an opposite story to that, we had last year Iris Demir, who she was at Farfetch. I forget where she's at now, but she was talking about how she came from an organization that was an observability first organization. And they're like, because executives like mandated ability, and that, you know, their team wasn't responsible for instrumenting code, even though like she was part of an observability team, like they were helping with practices, they were like managing infrastructure like the collectors, but application instrumentation was to be done by the application teams. And so it was a very different sort of outcome as a result, right? Because it's almost like, what are you going to say? Like, leadership has basically said that this is the way you're going to do it. So that's the way you're going to do it, compared to where I was at before, where I was trying to shape what observability for the org looked like. But unfortunately, leadership was like, they kind of half dipped their toes into the observability water. So they're like, not really.
Oh no, does this mean we all need to get promos to engineering leadership to make observability happen? Oh no.
Or be very persuasive.
Do you feel that, like, I hear what you're saying, but like I also feel like, in the spirit of the goal of observability and the goal of like pushing these responsibilities downward, it's like these top level mandates are really like, sure, maybe the team will do it at the end of the day, but they're never really like caring about it. Like, do you
Yeah.
think those two are like competing?
You have to have a convergence at the end of the day, right? Because like you need the mandate from the top, but like you have to have the folks willing to do it. And I think, like, to Paige's points in her talk, like, having people who are excited about observability and having a proper training program in place as well, to get the individual contributors, the ones who have an actual stake in this, who are going to be doing the work. Like, because if you don't have like that convergence from top and bottom, like, it's just going to be a half-assed thing.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in quickly. So the one experience I had, or the recent experience, that when teams start facing issues, like when they are trying to figure out one particular issue, they are fixing like the incident. I guess like even in not in incident, but they are trying to find a particular issue with the application, and then they need help, right? Like they don't know, they haven't done the training, or they don't know how to use the observability tool. I think that I kind of use that as a leverage, rather than have you done your have you instrumented your application correctly? Have you added the correct labels on your telemetry data? And then having used that kind of work as well. Like, okay, you want something that you want to help with identifying or figuring out this issue. I also want you to do your part as well. Make sure that you have done your part, then it will make it easier. So I think that was one tactic I've used in the past. But yeah, I think like from what I'm hearing so far, I had similar experience in my previous org. We were building our brand new platform, and luckily it was all written in Java, which meant that like we just kind of utilized the Java auto instrumentation, build out the kind of generic dashboard, and had all that kind of semantic convention baked into it, which meant that like all of the telemetry um, was easily identified. And we just went in all the application, and then because it was not that much effort on our part to then make that change, rather than like manually instrumenting everything. And then we had other teams which are like all their services were written in lambdas and goes. In that case, like, yeah, I had like 9 months project with them, trying to kind of pursue them, and slowly it's like kind of building set of all kind of POCs, and like based on the OTel, the extension layer, building out like a custom version of that, all configured. Like, just add this layer, at least that part is sorted for you. But then you just have to do the instrumentation part on your. So yeah, I guess it depends on the situation, but it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, Dan, it sounds like you're working within sort of that entrenched pattern where you're already seen as the owners, and that maybe like you've been able to do these tickets for them in the past, but now you want to change. I remember two things I've tried. One, we'll do this first one together. We'll pair on this, then you will know, and this will be great. Or I find an example PR that's like exactly like instrumenting the whatever the counter or the gauge you need, and like here, use this as a guide. So it is hard to come out of a already established pattern like that. But DoorDash did a talk at KubeCon about how they rolled out Service Mesh and sort of the challenges with giving people out of the box dashboards. I can find that and put it in the slide deck. They would be great to talk to because they kind of had a similar problem of being the owners. But we're at time. Oh my gosh. That went by quick.
If you have any more questions, you can reach Paige on the socials that she shared, or you can just search Paige Cruz in CNCF Slack. We will have this recording edited and up, I think, hopefully in the next couple weeks. It'll be on the OpenTelemetry YouTube channel.
Yeah, it's called OTel-official.
Yeah, so you know it's official.
Real.
Yes, give it a follow so that you can get all the latest updates.
And yeah, thank you all so much for being here. Paige, thank you so much. This was like a really great. I loved your slides. I screenshot a couple.
Please, I all work out in the open. So borrow whatever you need, adapt, extend. Let's bring more people to tracing. And please, yeah, email me and get in touch if you want to talk about this stuff more. I have spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Awesome. We will see you all next time.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.